As the international community focuses on the future of Syria, a critical European-American meeting is taking place in Rome today. Foreign ministers from Italy, France, Germany, the UK and the United States will discuss the future of Syria in the wake of significant political shifts, including the recent fall of President Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, the European Union and the US are weighing the possibility of easing sanctions on Syria to facilitate reconstruction and humanitarian aid. But questions remain. Will lifting these sanctions contribute to Syria's political transition? And can a Syrian-led peace process bring stability to a country torn apart by years of conflict? Welcome to In Depth. The UN Special Envoy to Syria, Geir Pedersen, has told the Security Council that the US sanctions exemption for transactions with governing institutions in Syria is welcome, but said much more significant work will inevitably be necessary. Pedersen told the Council he welcomes the recent issuance of a new temporary general license by the United States government, but added that much more work is fully addressing sanctions and designations will inevitably be necessary. On Monday, the US issued a sanction exemption known as a general license for transactions with governing institutions in Syria for 6 months in an effort to ease the flow of humanitarian assistance and allow some energy transactions. To assist Syria in its transitional phase, the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, is set to participate with foreign ministers from France, Germany, Italy, the UK and the US in a meeting discussing Syria, which will be hosted by Italy.
As Syria undergoes a transitional phase, foreign ministers from Italy, France, Germany, Britain and the United States are convening in Rome to address the evolving situation. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani will lead discussions focused on supporting Syria's new authorities and influencing the drafting of a new constitution. According to Italy's Foreign Ministry, the meeting aims to evaluate the progress of Syria's transitional government and to address the challenges in an upcoming National Dialogue Conference. Key topics include the drafting of a new constitution and strategies for Syria's economic recovery. The U.S. Department of State announced earlier that Secretary of State Antony Blinken will meet European counterparts, where they will advocate for a peaceful, inclusive, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition. Meanwhile, France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot indicated that European Union sanctions hindering humanitarian aid could be lifted, contingent on the new leadership's approach to the transition. In a move to facilitate humanitarian assistance, the U.S. recently issued a 6-month sanction exemption for transactions with governing institutions in Syria. As these discussions take place, what does the future hold for Syria's stability?
Right, and we're joined by Mr. Mohamed Osman, International Relations Specialist, to discuss the situation and this very important meeting. Mr. Osman, good evening to you, sir, and welcome to Qnews. If I may ask you about the meeting the US and the European foreign ministers are taking, and what does it signal? Or does it signal a potential shift in Syria's international relations? What do you think will be the strategic objectives of this meeting?
Thank you, Mona, for having me. Of course, it signals a very significant shift in Syrian-European relations and also in Syrian-US relations. Syria, since the 1960s, has been a core ally of regional and international powers that were considered as antagonistic to the West and Europe in particular, namely the Soviet Union and then Russia, and of course Iran. Now, with the fall of the Assad regime, or the Ba'athist regime in Syria, which presided over the country for over 54 years, and even before that, 58 years actually. Now it signals that Syria might actually become a partner and maybe even an ally of Europe and the United States in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean. Of course, Syria is of central importance to the Europeans in particular due to security considerations, of course, given that Syria was a net exporter of terrorism for quite a significant number of years during the Civil War, especially from 2014 until 2018. And many European cities witnessed massive terrorist attacks that were carried out by organizations and individuals affiliated with terrorist and extremist organizations inside Syria. So the Europeans have a vested interest in establishing a sort of partnership to maintain security and cooperate on counterterrorism with the new administration, despite, of course, the new administration having a very questionable background in this regard. And of course, they do have a very integral geopolitical interests over there too, because it's in Syria, it's in Europe's interest to curtail Russian influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Russia's only base on the Mediterranean lies in Syria. And now the Europeans are actually pressuring the Syrians to kick the Russians out, and so are the Americans. And of course, there are a multitude of economic opportunities in a country like Syria that can be exploited, of course.
Right, let me here welcome with us also Mr. Khalid Dawood, the Managing Director of Al Ahram Weekly. Thank you so much for joining us. And Mr. Khalid, if I may ask you, today's is this European-US ministerial meeting that is taking place in Italy. From your point of view, the timing of such a meeting at this very particular juncture of Syria's history, and what could be the main reasons for such a heightened international attention on Syria?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. But again, I guess this meeting is rather symbolic rather than anything else, because the whole world will be waiting for the new U.S. elect president, Donald Trump, to take over in almost 10 days. And in 10 days from now, we might see a totally different policy from President Trump as compared to the current Biden administration. So probably this has been described as Mr. Anthony Blinken, the last foreign trip before he leaves office. And the position and the stance of the current U.S. administration might not necessarily be the same as those of Mr. Trump when he takes office. Of course, this administration is mainly concerned about possible escalation in the northern parts of Syria, particularly between Turkey and the Syrian Democratic Forces known as Qassad, because again, there's been continuous attacks from Turkey against those Kurdish groups in the northern parts of Syria, claiming that the PKK or the Turkish Kurdish opposition are based there, and they are carrying attacks out of there. So, I mean, the United States is clearly worried about the future clashes between Turkey and those Kurdish groups, especially that those Kurdish groups, Syrian Democratic Forces, have been assisting the United States in fighting against the Islamic State over the past few years. And the Kurdish forces in Syria almost have been acting like an independent state under the former president Bashar Assad. And more important, they control one of the biggest ever prison camps for the ISIS fighters and their families. You're talking about Al-Hol camp, 9,000 fighters, along with thousands of family members. So, of course, the United States has been providing support for the Syrian Democratic Forces to maintain those camps. And if Turkey continues its attacks on the PKK bases in northern Syria, that's likely going to affect the future of this camp and possible release of the prisoners or escape of those prisoners, which will definitely pose a serious threat. So we've seen appeals from the United States in recent weeks after the fall of Bashar Assad to Turkey to show some restraint in its attacks on the Syrian Democratic Forces in hope to give the new de facto government there of Mr. Mohamed Julani or al-Shara some chance to form a stable government and to work on the other more important issues concerning the future of Syria, this so-called inclusive government that represents the different religions and the different ethnic groups within Syria itself, which is going to be, of course, very difficult in case fighting continues between Turkey and the Syrian Democratic Forces. And as I mentioned, Mr. Trump, when he gets into office, probably he'll give, or that's what some experts believe, is going to give a free hand to Turkey to deal with the Syrian issue, because as we have seen, the day President Bashar Assad or former President Bashar Assad fled to Russia, President Trump wrote that the U.S. has no interest in Syria and that he prefers for things to play on their own, and he has a very good relationship.
But Dr. Mr. Khalid, you have not told me here why this heightened attention to Syria from the European side, because this important meeting is taking place in Italy. But we'll get back. I'll get back to you, Mr. Osman. There has been talk of lifting certain economic sanctions on Syria to facilitate aid and the reconstruction process. What do you think the European Union and the US would need to see in Syria's transition process for them to fully lift those sanctions? And what do they want from Syria's new government in return for lifting those sanctions?
Lifting sanctions will have conditions that have to be fulfilled, and this is quite understandable and quite logical in the bigger scheme of things, given the very complex situation inside Syria and its regional ramifications. But however, so far, the West, meaning European Union countries and the United States, all of them do not have a unified position on Syria. And I think that might be the reason behind today's meeting in Rome. However, as Mr. Khalid said, I do not think they will reach any consensus at this point, because the most important player in this meeting, the US administration, is an outgoing administration. It's leaving in roughly 11 days. And a new administration is coming in. There is talk that there are representatives of the Trump administration who are part of the current US delegation. However, I cannot see them reaching a certain consensus, given, of course, the very different remarks made by President Trump in this regard. So when it comes to sanctions, I think the lifting of the sanctions will differ from one country to the other. So take the United States, for example, under the Biden administration. They will focus on eliminating Russian presence inside Syria as a precondition, and the European Union collectively also announced that Kallas, the foreign relations representative and the vice president of the European Commission, said that that one of the preconditions of lifting sanctions is the expulsion of the Russian bases, for example. And also one other factor that will play into that is, of course, things that are related to security. As I mentioned in my previous intervention, security and counterterrorism is very important. The current Syrian government has to present certain guarantees that they will not be an exporter of terrorism and extremism. And I think they are working on that. They are being very pragmatic about it. And this is what is building confidence between them and the European Union, as well as the United States. And finally, and the least important, however, it does matter at the end of the day, is the human rights situation inside Syria, and especially the situation of ethnic and religious minorities. And this is where the situation becomes very grim in many ways, because so far, according to human rights organizations, over 130 summary executions and extrajudicial killings have taken place that were carried out by militants associated with the new with the forces that led the violent takeover inside Syria. And those 150 executions were on the Syrian coast, Tartus and Ladiqiyah, in addition to Hama, according to reputed Syrian human rights organizations. So, of course, this will raise concerns. And, of course, the situation of the Kurds. The French have provided unequivocal support to, for example, President Macron himself said that we will not abandon the Kurds, the SDF. And on the other hand, Turkey, a core NATO member and a very pivotal player inside Syria, said that they will not accept it and even threatened that they might militarily intervene in order to disarm the Kurds. So you can see how complex the situation is, Mona.
Yes. Mr. Dawood, from your own perspective, how do the US and European countries view Syria's reconstruction and political transition? And what do you think would be their primary concerns regarding this process?
Well, I think what will determine not just the European and American policies towards Syria, but the entire world's the way of dealing with Syria are developments on the ground there. I mean, the challenges are so many after the downfall of a regime that's been in office for more than 5 decades. And indeed, the background of the current de facto government in Syria, with Mr. al-Shara originally belonging to Al-Qaeda and to Daesh, and the militant groups that supported him over the past few years, are a serious source of worry for European countries, for the United States, and for Arab countries as well. Let's not forget about that, because if Syria at the end of the day turns into a safe haven for terrorist organizations from all over the world, that's going to be something that's going to affect us here in the region before the United States and Europe. I mean, so that's an issue of concern, how the new government is going, or the de facto government, because it's not even officially a government, how the de facto government there is going to handle the situation. There have been some worrying signs, as Mr. Osman has mentioned, concerning sectarian killings and taking revenge from members of the Alawite minority that former President Bashar Assad belonged to. But equally important, the announcement by Ahmed al-Shara that no elections are going to take place before 4 years, and the delays in the so-called national dialogue that he's called for. These are all issues that are certainly going to affect how Europe, the United States, and the main Arab countries are going to deal with the future of Syria, and let alone, of course, the Israeli plots and plans concerning the future of Syria. They've given no chance for the current government to show their intentions, despite the fact that Ahmed al-Shara repeated that he would not attack Israel, that he has no interest in this point to attack Israel. But nevertheless, Israel occupied additional Syrian territories. They continued to carry out air raids inside Syria, and they have expressed openly that they have no trust in the current Syrian regime, describing Mr. Shara as a wolf in sheep's clothes. Basically, that's what the deputy foreign minister of Israel has said. So there are many challenges on the ground that will determine how the entire world will deal with Syria, with the reconstruction, with the stability of Syria, and of course how the lifting of sanctions is also going to be related to this issue. As you've known, the deputy or assistant secretary of state for the Middle East Affairs, Mrs. Barbara Leaf, she met with al-Shara. She refused to meet him at the presidential palace, not to give him total recognition, but they have canceled the bounty that they have announced for the arrest of Mr. Shara, worth $10 million. They have announced lifting some minor sanctions for 6 months for humanitarian reasons. But again, the decision on whether to lift the name of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which Mr. al-Shara leads, from the list of terrorism is a matter that remains to be seen, depending on their actions on the ground and their ability to form a stable government that represents the majority of the Syrian people. But if the fighting continues, if revenge attacks continues, that's definitely not going to be a prescription that's going to help Syria towards rebuilding its future, or even rebuilding its army, because definitely it's a very worrying sign when the new de facto government in Syria, led by Mr. al-Shara, starts giving military ranks to well-known terrorists from all over the world because they supported their fight against Bashar over the past 10 or 12 years. So, and again, as well, I mean, receiving some figures, even including Egyptian figures, who've been sentenced
Clear, definitely, Mr. Dawood, what you're speaking about, and we've heard the reports. Mr. Osman, the idea of a Syrian-led political transition is often brought up in discussions. What does this concept truly mean from the American-European perspective?
Well, from the American-European perspective, theoretically, and I repeat, theoretically, it means that it should be an inclusive, democratic transition, political transition that reflects all of the different segments of Syrian society and the Syrian political spectrum. Of course, this is what a sound and stable political transition means. However, the situation on the ground is much more complex than that. First of all, the current government, the current de facto government, as Mr. Khalid said, in Syria, is not really showing any signs that it will commit to such a diversity-oriented or democratic transition. Talk of postponing elections for 4 years, that to drafting a constitution will take over 3 years, that they will convene a national dialogue. However, the parameters of this national dialogue and its components and its agenda has not been determined, and there aren't even any preparatory sessions for this grand national dialogue. All that we know is that it will be convened soon. We don't know when soon is, supposedly in January, and that 1,200 people will participate. Who these 1,200 people are, no one has any idea. So, and of course, in this sense, there is a complete disregard of the previous institutions of transitions that were under the UN auspices. For example, the Constitutional Committee that was formed by the UN, composed of 150 members, including 50 members of the opposition, 50 members that represent civil society, and of course 50 members that were chosen by the former regime. Now this committee can be reformed because we have something to work with within the framework of Resolution 2254. However, we have not seen any serious commitment from the current government to the implementation of 2254, even if in its reformed version. So, but again, this is theoretical. What matters for the West, and at the end of the day, is their interests. If Al-Shara will establish an authoritarian regime that can guarantee Western interests, then they will be completely okay with it.
Right. Let me go to Mr. Dawood here. And how can we read the European American interests in dealing with the building relations with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as we saw recently when the French and German foreign ministers visited Syria to meet with Ahmed Shara?
Well, again, I mean, I cannot even speak of a united European position on this matter. I mean, maybe France is more ready to lift sanctions against the current de facto government more than, say, for example, the Italians or the Germans. I mean, and let alone the fact that Germany itself will witness elections very soon, in a matter of like a few weeks, 2 months. They're going to have a new government. And so probably nobody knows. I mean, most indications are it's going to be conservative government. Nobody knows how its attitude is going to be towards the Syrian situation. Britain has a different stand. But let me tell you that this meeting happens one day before the Italian foreign minister heads to Damascus to meet with the new government, while we acknowledge and everybody knows that the current Italian government has been relatively friendly to the former regime of Bashar al-Assad. They saw him as a sign of stability for Syria. And the key issue, perhaps, that unites the Europeans particularly is the matter of immigration. As you know, after the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, I mean, there have been millions of Syrians who have flooded European nations, particularly Germany. Most of those countries right now have suspended the giving refugee status to any more Syrians trying to seek that refugee status. So, I mean, the issues of immigration is a prime matter for European countries, and the issue of terrorism as well. I mean, the Syrian government needs to show some serious signs that it's not going to turn into another Afghanistan, for example, or a government that's not going to represent the diversity of the Syrian society, the rights of women, the rights of Christians, the rights of the Shiite minority. These are all issues that are matters of concern, and that's why I said, I mean, what's going to convince whether Europe, the United States, or anybody else on the future of Syria is how they act on the ground.
Yes.
And of course, we're also waiting for the new Trump administration, how it's going to deal with Syria and whether it's going to give Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, a free hand to deal with Syria rather than getting directly involved.
Indeed, remains to be seen. And that was Mr. Khalid Dawood, managing editor of Al Ahram Weekly, and Mr. Mohamed Osman, international relations specialist. We thank you both, gentlemen, for your very fruitful insights. That brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Many thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.